There is a certain kind of grace that the world recognizes instantly but rarely questions, the kind that feels effortless on the surface, yet is almost always built on something far more complicated underneath. And for decades, Julie Andrews embodied that kind of grace so completely that audiences across the world accepted it as natural, as if she had simply been born into it, as if the woman singing on a hilltop or gliding through a London street with an umbrella had never known instability, fear, or loss. But the truth is that long before she became the symbol of warmth, composure, and quiet authority, she was a child navigating a world that demanded resilience far earlier than it should have. She was born Julia Elizabeth Wells in 1935 in Walton-on-Thames, England, during a time when Europe was already moving toward war, and by the time she was old enough to form memories, the world around her was shaped by uncertainty, air raids, and the fragile routines of families trying to hold themselves together under pressure. But the instability in Julie's life was not only external, it was also deeply personal, as her parents' marriage began to fracture when she was still very young, eventually ending in divorce when she was around 4 years old, a moment that quietly redefined the structure of her childhood and set her on a path that would be anything but conventional. Her mother remarried a man named Ted Andrews, a performer in the English entertainment circuit, and it was from him that Julie would take the surname the world would later know. But along with that name came a household that was far from stable, one marked by unpredictability and tension, particularly when alcohol was involved. And although Julie Andrews would later describe those years with careful restraint, the picture that emerges is unmistakable: a home where fear existed alongside routine, where children learned to read the atmosphere quickly, and where emotional safety was never guaranteed. And it is in that kind of environment that certain qualities are formed not through intention, but through necessity: the ability to remain composed, to adapt quickly, and to carry on even when circumstances are far from ideal. What made Julie different, what gave her not only an escape but also a direction, was her voice, a remarkable instrument that revealed itself early and with undeniable clarity, a 4-octave soprano that immediately set her apart from other children. And it did not take long for the adults around her to recognize that this was not simply a talent, but an opportunity. And so while other children were still navigating school and play, Julie was already performing, already stepping onto stages, already learning that her voice was not just part of who she was, but something that carried expectations, responsibilities, and eventually financial weight for her family. By the age of 12, she was performing at the London Palladium in front of the royal family, an experience that would be overwhelming for most adults, let alone a child. And yet she stood there and delivered a performance that reportedly stunned the audience into silence before erupting into applause. And in that moment, something crystallized, not just for the people watching, but for Julie herself. Because the stage was no longer simply a place she visited, it became a place she belonged. And more importantly, a place that offered structure and control in contrast to the unpredictability of her home life. But there is a cost to that kind of early success, a cost that is rarely visible to the audience, because while her voice opened doors and created opportunities, it also accelerated her entry into adulthood, placing her in a position where discipline, professionalism, and performance were expected long before she had the chance to experience a truly carefree childhood. And this duality would follow her throughout her life. The idea that the very thing that saved her also shaped her in ways that were not entirely gentle. By the time she reached her late teens, Julie Andrews was already an experienced performer, someone who had spent years refining her craft, developing stage presence, and understanding the demands of an audience. And so when the opportunity came in 1954 for her to travel to the United States and perform on Broadway in a production called The Boyfriend, she stepped into it not as an uncertain newcomer, but as a young woman who had already lived a professional life, even if she was only 19 years old. New York was a different world entirely, louder, faster, more competitive, but it was also the center of a theatrical culture that was evolving rapidly, and Julie Andrews arrived at exactly the right moment, because Broadway in the 1950s was entering a golden era, one defined by ambitious productions, strong musical storytelling, and a generation of creators who were redefining what theater could be. And when she stepped onto that stage, something remarkable happened. She didn't just perform. She commanded attention, the kind of attention that signals not just talent, but presence. It wasn't long before the people shaping the future of musical theater took notice, and among them were Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Loewy, who were in the process of developing a musical adaptation of George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, a project that would become My Fair Lady, one of the most celebrated productions in Broadway history. And when the time came to cast the role of Eliza Doolittle, Julie Andrews was chosen. A decision that would change the trajectory of her career in ways that even she could not have fully anticipated. When My Fair Lady opened in 1956, it was not just a success, it was a phenomenon, the kind of production that redefines expectations and sets new standards. And at the center of it all was Julie Andrews, delivering a performance that balanced technical precision with emotional authenticity, transforming Eliza Doolittle from a simple character into a fully realized journey of transformation. And audiences responded with overwhelming enthusiasm, returning night after night, year after year, until the show reached a staggering 2,717 performances. For nearly 6 years, Julie Andrews lived inside that role, refining it, deepening it, carrying it through countless performances, and in doing so, she became inseparable from it in the eyes of audiences and critics alike. She was Eliza Doolittle, not just the original, but the definitive version, and it seemed almost inevitable that when the time came to bring My Fair Lady to the screen, she would carry that role with her into film, completing the transition from stage to cinema in a way that felt both logical and deserved. But Hollywood does not always follow logic, and when Warner Brothers made the decision to produce the film version of My Fair Lady, they chose not to cast Julie Andrews, instead selecting Audrey Hepburn, a decision driven by considerations of star power and international appeal. And while the reasoning may have made sense from a business perspective, it created one of the most controversial casting decisions in film history, because the actress who had defined the role, who had shaped it over 6 years of performance, was suddenly told that she was not the right choice for the camera. The irony of the situation was difficult to ignore. Audrey Hepburn, though immensely talented, did not have the vocal strength required for the role, and her singing would ultimately be dubbed, while Julie Andrews, whose voice was considered one of the finest of her generation, was left outside the project she had helped build. And although she handled the situation with remarkable composure in public, the disappointment was real, the kind that does not need to be expressed loudly to be deeply felt. And yet, it was precisely at the moment when one door closed in a way that felt both unfair and final that another opened, not gradually, but suddenly, in the form of a call from Walt Disney, who was developing a film based on a series of children's books about a magical nanny. And he wanted Julie Andrews for the lead role, a role that would soon become one of the most iconic in film history, Mary Poppins. Accepting that role would not only redefine her career, it would reshape the narrative of what had initially seemed like a professional setback, because sometimes the opportunities that appear to be losses are in fact redirections, moments where the path shifts in ways that only make sense in retrospect. And for Julie Andrews, Mary Poppins was exactly that kind of moment, a turning point that would carry her from the stage into the center of global cinema, and into a level of recognition that few performers ever achieve. When Mary Poppins was released in 1964, it was unlike anything audiences had seen before, blending live action with animation, music with narrative, fantasy with emotional grounding, and at the center of it all was Julie Andrews, delivering a performance that felt both magical and controlled, warm yet authoritative, whimsical yet precise. And it resonated deeply with audiences, not just because of the spectacle, but because of the authenticity she brought to the role. The sense that beneath the magic was a person who understood exactly what she was doing. The film was a massive success, both commercially and critically, and when award season arrived, Julie Andrews was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress, while Audrey Hepburn was notably absent from the nominations for My Fair Lady, a detail that did not go unnoticed. And when Julie stepped onto the stage to accept her Oscar, she delivered a line of gratitude that subtly acknowledged the irony of the situation, thanking the man who had made it all possible. A reference that the audience understood immediately and responded to with both laughter and applause. In a single year, she had gone from being passed over for a defining role to becoming an Academy Award-winning actress. And as if that were not enough, the following year brought another film that would cement her place in cinematic history, The Sound of Music, a production that would elevate her from a successful actress to a cultural icon. And as the cameras rolled across the hills of Austria, capturing the now legendary opening sequence, Julie Andrews stood at the center of a moment that would echo across generations, even if, at the time, she could not yet know just how far that echo would reach. The Sound of Music was released in 1965, and what followed was not just success, but something much larger, something that transcended the usual boundaries of cinema and entered the realm of cultural memory. Because this was not simply a film people watched, it was a film people carried with them, a story that became part of family traditions, part of childhoods, part of the emotional language of entire generations, and at the center of it all was Julie Andrews, once again anchoring the spectacle with a performance that felt both effortless and deeply grounded, as if she were not acting at all, but simply existing within the story. She played Maria, a young woman caught between duty and desire, structure and freedom, and she brought to the role a balance that is extraordinarily difficult to achieve, a sense of innocence that never became naive, a strength that never became rigid, and a warmth that never felt forced. And audiences responded not just to the songs or the scenery, but to her, to the presence she carried into every frame. The same presence that had once filled a theater in London and now filled cinemas around the world. The film became one of the highest grossing productions of its time, eventually holding the record for box office success, and with that came a level of fame that very few performers ever experience, a kind of recognition that is both global and deeply personal, because people did not just know who Julie Andrews was, they felt as though they knew her, as though the characters she played were extensions of the person herself, and this is where the paradox begins. Because the more convincingly she embodied these roles, the more difficult it became for the industry to see her as anything else. By the late 1960s, Julie Andrews had become not just an actress, but an image, a symbol of wholesomeness, grace, and reliability. And while that image brought her enormous success, it also began to limit the kinds of roles she was offered, because Hollywood, like many industries, tends to hold on to what works, even when it no longer fits the person at the center of it. And so the challenge she faced was not one of talent or opportunity, but of perception. How to move beyond an image that had become both her greatest asset and her most restrictive boundary. The films that followed The Sound of Music were attempts, some more successful than others, to navigate that transition, to explore different tones, different characters, different aspects of her ability. But the timing could not have been more difficult because the film industry itself was undergoing a transformation, shifting away from the grand musical productions that had defined the previous decade and toward a new kind of storytelling, one that was darker, more realistic, and less interested in the kind of idealized narratives that had made Julie Andrews a star. As a result, several of her projects during this period struggled at the box office, and the industry, in its tendency to simplify complex situations into convenient labels, began to describe her as box office poison, a phrase that was as harsh as it was misleading, because it ignored the broader context, the changing tastes of audiences, the decline of the musical genre, and the fact that she herself was navigating a transition that would have been challenging for any performer, regardless of talent or reputation. At the same time, her personal life was undergoing its own quiet transformation. Her marriage to Tony Walton, which had begun with shared ambitions and mutual understanding, gradually came to an end, not with scandal or public conflict, but with a kind of quiet dissolution that reflected the reality of two people whose lives had moved in different directions. And while she rarely spoke about it publicly, the emotional impact of that separation was real, adding another layer to a period that was already marked by professional uncertainty. But if there is a consistent thread running through Julie Andrews' life, it is the ability to adapt without losing her sense of self. And that ability became particularly evident when she entered the next chapter of her life, both personally and professionally, through her relationship with director Blake Edwards, a man whose perspective on the entertainment industry was far more cynical, far more analytical, and in many ways, far more aligned with the complexities she herself had experienced. Their partnership, which began in the late 1960s and led to marriage in 1969, became one of the most significant relationships of her life, not only because of the emotional support it provided, but because of the creative opportunities it opened. And one of the most defining moments of that collaboration came in 1981 with a film that surprised many audiences, a film that deliberately challenged the image she had carried for so long. In SOB, Julie Andrews appeared in a way that directly contradicted the persona that had defined her career, making a bold and deliberate statement that she was not confined to the roles people expected her to play. And while the moment itself was brief, its significance was substantial because it signaled a shift, not just in how audiences might see her, but in how she saw herself as an artist capable of complexity, contradiction, and reinvention. That same year brought Victor of Victoria, a film that would become one of the most celebrated performances of her career. A story layered with identity, performance, and transformation, and one that required her to navigate multiple levels of character simultaneously, blending humor, vulnerability, and technical precision in a way that showcased not just her voice, but her full range as an actress. And the result was a performance that critics and audiences alike recognized as something exceptional, a reminder of what she had always been capable of when given the right material. At this point, it might have seemed as though her career had found a new balance, a second act defined not by the constraints of earlier expectations, but by a more nuanced understanding of her abilities, and for a time, that balance held, allowing her to continue working, exploring, and evolving within an industry that had once struggled to redefine her. And then, in 1997, something happened that no career strategy, no reinvention, no amount of experience could have prepared her for. Something that did not come from the outside world of studios or audiences, but from within her own body. The one place where control is often assumed but never guaranteed. She underwent surgery on her throat to remove benign nodules, a procedure that, on the surface, seemed routine, particularly for someone whose career had been built on singing. But the outcome was anything but routine, because the surgery damaged her vocal cords in a way that fundamentally altered her ability to produce the voice that had defined her entire life. And in the immediate aftermath, the reality became clear. The instrument she had relied on for decades was no longer the same, and might never be again. It is difficult to fully articulate what that kind of loss means, particularly for someone whose identity is so closely tied to a specific ability. Because this was not simply a professional setback, it was the loss of something deeply personal, something that had been present since childhood, something that had provided not just a career, but a sense of direction, purpose, and escape. And suddenly, it was gone. Not entirely, but in a form that could no longer function as it once had. Julie Andrews pursued legal action, and the case was eventually settled, but no outcome, financial or otherwise, could restore what had been lost. And so, the challenge became something entirely different. Not how to recover, but how to continue, how to redefine a life and a career without the very element that had once defined both. And once again, she adapted, not by attempting to replicate what had been, but by exploring what remained, shifting her focus toward acting roles that did not require singing, toward narration, toward writing, particularly children's books co-created with her daughter Emma, building a new creative identity that, while different, was no less meaningful. In 2001, she appeared in The Princess Diaries, introducing herself to a new generation in a role that, in many ways, reflected the arc of her own career. A queen, composed, wise, and quietly authoritative, guiding a younger character through a transformation she herself had experienced in a different form. And the film's success demonstrated something important, that her connection with audiences had never been dependent on a single ability, but on something deeper. Something that transcended voice, genre, or era. As the years continued, she remained present in the cultural landscape, lending her voice to animated films, appearing in projects that reached audiences who had never seen her earlier work. And in doing so, she achieved something rare, a continuity across generations that very few performers manage, maintaining relevance not by clinging to the past, but by evolving alongside the present. Her marriage to Blake Edwards remained a central part of her life until his death in 2010, a loss that, like so many others, she carried with the same quiet strength that had defined her journey from the beginning. And in the years that followed, she continued to work, to write, to engage with the world in ways that reflected not just resilience, but a genuine commitment to the craft she had embraced as a child. And so when we look back at the life of Julie Andrews, it becomes clear that the word tragic, while not entirely inaccurate, does not fully capture the reality of her story. Because yes, there were losses, significant ones, a childhood shaped by instability, a marriage that ended, a career that faced unexpected challenges, and most notably, the loss of her singing voice. But alongside those losses is something equally important, something that defines not just what happened to her, but how she responded to it. She remained herself. Through every transition, every setback, every reinvention, she maintained a sense of identity that was not dependent on public perception, not limited by industry expectations, and not diminished by the absence of what had once been her greatest gift. And that, perhaps more than any role she ever played, is the most remarkable part of her story. Because in the end, Julie Andrews did not simply portray grace, she lived it. Not as an abstract quality, but as a series of choices. Choices to continue, to adapt, to remain open to new forms of expression, even when the old ones were no longer available. And in doing so, she created a legacy that extends far beyond any single performance. A legacy built not just on talent, but on the quiet, persistent strength of someone who never allowed circumstance to define her completely. And that is what remains, not just the films, not just the songs preserved in recordings, but the example of a life lived with consistency, dignity, and an understanding that even when something essential is lost, there is still a path forward, still a story worth telling, and still a voice, even if it sounds different than it once did. If this story gave you a new way of seeing Julie Andrews, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because there are many more stories like this one that history never tells the full way.